It's Genghis Khan time.
Чимээний их чиргийг харгалах гэж ордлоо. Утлуугүй чимээний их чиргийн өмнө өвдөх сохрон унмаа.
So, Genghis Khan or Chinggis Khan, depending upon which version you use, we know a lot about. The name Genghis Khan is not actually a name. It basically amounts to Great Emperor or Great Khan, Khan being basically the rough equivalent of Emperor. So we know a lot about Genghis Khan, which of course is natural for someone who comes closest to actually conquering the world. But before he was Genghis Khan, he was Temujin, basically a tribal chieftain, and we know actually precious little about him. So here's what we do know about Temujin. He was born as the son of a chief in the Borijan clan. Apparently, his father dies when he is at the ripe old age of 8, and at that point, he's basically abandoned by the rest of his clan. He ultimately decides to kill his older half-brother to secure the succession, which, morality aside, actually, I suppose, is a pretty shrewd career move. But that tells you something about Genghis Khan. When the chips are down, he is absolutely prepared to bend or sometimes even break many of the rules. At the same time, it's going to be interesting to note which rules he actually considers sacrosanct and reveres. Fortunately, things get a lot better for Temujin. He manages to attract a small following based upon his charisma, and he manages to also secure an alliance with 2 tribal leaders. Now, the first order of business of this new alliance is to basically rescue Genghis Khan's newly wedded wife, Borta, who apparently was captured by raiders. Yeah. So, that happens, so good for Genghis Khan, except for the fact that one of those tribal allies, by the name of Jamuka, basically betrays Genghis and badly defeats him. Then he manages to essentially recover his strength. And then, of course, the other tribal leader, a guy by the name of Togrul, also attacks Genghis Khan and defeats him. In much of East Asia, Genghis Khan kind of becomes synonymous with military excellence and invincibility. But this was certainly not something that Genghis Khan really felt. If anything, Genghis Khan doesn't feel invincibility. He feels this feeling of vulnerability and weakness for the rest of his life. And he decides ultimately to do something about it. Like with the other great warrior we've talked about, Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan, according to legend, has divine or semi-divine origins. So, according to legend, Genghis Khan is born with a blood clot in his hand, which, according to East Asian tradition and folklore, is basically a sign that Genghis Khan will either be a warrior or something of a conqueror. There is also some speculation that Genghis Khan's mother, again according to legend, was impregnated by a ray of light, basically indicating divine provenance. Now, compared to Alexander the Great, whose mother was apparently impregnated by Zeus in snake form, somehow that seems like a step up. So, Genghis Khan does a number of things that marks him as a great leader. Firstly, it's the fact that for most conquerors at this period of time, particularly conquerors from the steppe, most warriors earn their salary or their wage from basically looting or plundering the remains of the enemy, focusing on their baggage or even sometimes bodily remains. But it was generally expected that the leader of the victorious army would be able to claim the largest share of the loot. Genghis Khan didn't do that. Genghis Khan actually had contempt for luxury and basically lived a pretty simple life for as long as he was alive. Genghis Khan was a bit of a jerk. He was capable of immense cruelty. He eventually, either personally or through his armies, slaughtered millions of people. Like, this is not a guy you want to be on the bad side of. but at the same time, he was capable of enormous loyalty and mercy in very specific situations. So what we can say about Genghis Khan is he awarded initiative, he awarded merit, and he rewarded loyalty. If he felt you were loyal, that loyalty, he was also basically loyal to you. And he essentially wasn't really suspicious of those people who he felt whose loyalty was sort of above reproach. At the same time, if you really ticked him off, particularly interestingly, if you happen to kill some of his messengers, that alone might be a pretext for the Mongols to not only come after you, but to destroy, quite literally, your entire civilization. One example of that loyalty and that merit is the case of Subutai, who is considered, along with Genghis Khan, one of the greatest commanders in all of history. We don't exactly know what Subutai's origins were, but as far as we can tell, he may have been a blacksmith. He may have actually been some kind of deer herder, so certainly not well born whatsoever. And yet, he eventually will command the destiny of entire nations, leading some of the Khan's armies. Also, Genghis Khan is so confident in Subutai's loyalty that Subutai has occasions where he basically dips out from Genghis Khan's main army, and basically Subutai just kind of does his own thing. And Genghis Khan is more or less okay with it because he knows that if Subutai is doing something, it must be for a pretty darn good reason. After crushing the people who betrayed him, there is what we call a Kurultai in the year 1206 at the Mongol capital of Karakorum. It's there that Temujin is anointed Genghis Khan, which again either means Great Khan, Universal Khan. There's speculation, by the way, that, the word Khan originally comes from Kagan, K-H-A-G, I can spell, let me start that again. Khagan, but eventually the G becomes silent, so in English we refer to it as Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan ultimately unifies the Mongol people by trying to break tribal loyalties, which, again, oftentimes these tribal loyalties have been responsible for political assassinations, revolts, all kinds of chaos. And so you take those tribal loyalties and instead you replace it with a system that emphasizes personal and direct loyalty to the Khan. And, of course, on the flip side, the Khan would be loyal to you as long as you stayed on his good side. In warfare, Genghis Khan adopts this approach that if it's not broke, don't fix it. The Mongols were already fairly natural fighters, they just needed to be channeled appropriately. So Genghis Khan takes this fairly unruly mob of warriors and turns them into disciplined soldiers. He does that by first organizing all of his forces as cavalry, which most of them already are because they're Mongols, they're used to basically existing on the steppe and riding on horses. He organizes them further into light cavalry. These are cavalry forces that are designed to harass the enemy with bows and javelins and that kind of thing. And as we talked about earlier, lure the enemy into ambushes. Then he also has his heavy cavalry, and these are basically human tanks armed with heavy lances and swords. And they also have Chinese-style heavy armor. The way he organizes them, however, beyond that, is he organizes them in groups of 10. So you had 100 soldiers at the low end, and they are organized further into groups of 1,000, and then they are organized into units called tormans that are organized into blocks of 10,000. So what Genghis would do is not only would he teach these soldiers to fight as a unit, he would put his best generals in independent command of a lot of these tormans. Now, most armies at this time period didn't divide up like that. At the very least, they didn't divide up into groups of 10,000 troops. The conventional wisdom was that was like wasting your strength. You want to fight united as a force. Well, Genghis Khan realized that all rules are meant to be bent, if not broken. So what he realized is if you give your soldiers, if you give your top commanders soldiers of their own to command, these groups of 10,000, maybe what can happen is that Subutai can go out and lead 10,000 men, lure the enemy into Genghis Khan's main army, and maybe in the process, Genghis Khan's main army could attack the enemy in the rear, Subutai could attack in the front, and you can basically encircle them. So, because of the fast cavalry forces, and the fact that Mongolian cavalry was among the best in the world and could definitely outpace that of the enemy, Genghis Khan makes fighting in a divided way work for him in a way that it just doesn't work in most of the rest of the world. So after being appointed Great Khan, in 1207 he launches his first campaign, and this is a campaign to defeat the Jijia kingdom. If you remember previously on AP World, we were talking about how China was divided into three kingdoms during the Song dynasty, where you had the Liao to the north and the Jijia to the west. So the Jijia are quickly attacked and pretty easily overrun. Next is the Jin. And if you remember, the Jin are actually ancestrally Mongols. They had come in and taken the Liao pretty early on. And the issue is that the Mongols are absolutely dominant on the field of battle. But when it comes to sieges, that's a different question altogether. The Jin have fortified cities. The Mongols don't really have the experience with siege warfare. And maybe for many a Mongol conqueror, this would have been a limiting factor. The Huns, who are the ancestors or sort of distant cousins of the Mongols, tried to sack Constantinople. And when Attila and his forces get to the outer walls of the city, they take a look at them and go, nope, and basically gallop off to Rome. So the cities could have stopped Genghis Khan's conquest, but what happens is he ultimately captures Chinese scholars and Chinese siege weapons like catapults and battering rams, and he uses them to conquer the cities of the Jin. After conquering the Jin, Genghis Khan leads his armies to the west, where he encounters the Karakitai Empire in what is now modern-day Kazakhstan. Basically, the Karakitai are ethnically and culturally Turkish, but they incorporate a Chinese-like political organization. In basically a year, Genghis Khan sweeps through the Karakitai Empire. Now, Genghis Khan's first recourse was not really to conquer. Oftentimes, he just wanted to establish profitable trade relations, and just like the Tang, he could be more or less content if you paid him tribute. Well, let's just say the Khwarezm Empire does not do that. At first, Genghis Khan sends envoys to the Khwarezm Empire, actually hoping for the preservation of a trade route. And what happens is that the envoys are instantly accused of spying and arrested. Genghis Khan holds his temper and sends in more envoys to visit the Khwarezm Empire. And this time, the envoys are actually put to death. So Genghis Khan calmly reacts to that by invading with 150,000 men. Khwarezm Empire is actually fairly unique and fairly diverse. Ethnically, they're of Turkish extraction, but culturally, they've adopted Persian customs and the Persian language. Or at least that was the case before the Mongols arrived. So after the execution of Genghis Khan's emissaries, Genghis Khan reacts, like I said, by invading with a massive army and essentially undertaking a campaign of almost genocide, where many cities are taken. Sometimes only the male population is massacred, and then sometimes the entire population is utterly massacred. The heir to the Shah of the Khwarezm Empire, Muhammad II, actually attempts to flee into northwestern India, and the Khan's forces actually pursue him all the way there. So you could kind of say it was a blood feud. So on the one hand, you see the subduing of, many cities, of many principalities that are done more or less, I don't want to say bloodlessly, but where the population is basically preserved, where you see the Mongols capturing artisans and scholars while preserving most of the population. And then in other cases, like the Khwarezm Empire, the entire population is basically destroyed. So this represents the Mongolian Empire at its furthest extent. You notice that basically the territory of Genghis Khan ranges from the Pacific all the way to the Caspian Sea. And essentially, he gets as far as the Khwarezm Empire. You'll notice that there's still a considerable number of states that oppose him. You have India to the south. You have, of course, the Song dynasty as well to the south. And then there's also the Abbasid Caliphate right here. But the question is, before we get to those areas, is what is the empire of Genghis Khan actually like? Here's what we can say about the Mongols. They would slaughter you indiscriminately if you tried to oppose them. But if you didn't try to oppose them, they were, I don't want to say chill, but for lack of a better term, fairly chill. They allowed general religious toleration. They were very interested in new ideas. We already saw that with the incorporation of Chinese scholars and engineers, especially to capitalize on their knowledge of siege warfare, but they're also interested in Greco-Islamic medical knowledge, mathematics, and they were actually genuinely interested in religion and philosophy. The Mongols themselves practiced a religion that was fairly animistic in nature called Tengri, but they were also sort of attracted by encounters with other religions, especially like Islam. They established a capital at Karakorum, and they also more or less dominate the entirety of the Silk Road, which gives them a huge amount of revenue. So continuing, they, like the Muslims before them, help preserve Greco-Roman knowledge. Religions and cultures are generally tolerated by the Mongols. Again, the limiting factor is whether or not you actually try to oppose them. There is a script devised for the Mongol language called the Uyghur script. But the thing is that the Mongol Empire, like most of the great empires before them, they expand with violence. But once the initial violence has been dealt out, people are attracted to the stability that the empire brings. So you basically, like we talked about with the Song depend more on overseas trade than the Silk Road because the Silk Road is unpredictable. They have multiple hostile states in the way, so that's kind of taking a gamble. Now that the Mongols basically stretch from the Pacific all the way almost into the foothills of Europe by 1227, now the Silk Road can actually be depended upon again. We should also differentiate the Mongol Empire from, let's say, the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was interested in attacking a place, colonizing it, building roads, building infrastructure. I'm not saying the Mongols didn't do that, but the Mongols were usually much more interested in almost running a protection racket than administering territories. Sort of like the Tang, they were more interested in collecting tribute than actually sort of micromanaging how all of their imperial provinces were run. So in 1226, Genghis Khan realizes that he has some unfinished business. You see, Western Jia refuses to offer Genghis Khan tribute. He also refuses to send hostages to Genghis Khan's court. So Genghis Khan mobilizes his forces, fresh from his victories over the Khwarezm Empire, and begins moving on Western Jia. We don't know a lot about Western Jia, or Jijia, as we've been calling them. The reason being is the Mongols. Basically, Jijia was taken, conquered in its entirety, and for its insolence, its emperor is executed, and basically a good chunk of the population and a lot of its cultural artifacts utterly destroyed. During the midst of the Western Jia campaign, Genghis Khan dies. There's some speculation that he may have died from some kind of wound or just dies in battle. The most likely cause, actually, is that Genghis Khan dies because of the Black Plague. So the Great Khan was no more. His body was taken to Karakorum for burial, and once he was buried, basically a huge chunk of his troops basically ride over his burial spot so that any trace of the location of his body is lost to time and to history. So that is the end of Genghis Khan. It is not, however, the end of the Mongolian Empire, for Genghis Khan has 3 sons and 1 grandson. And specifically, he has his favorite son, Ogedai Khan. Ogedai is not Genghis Khan's firstborn son. His firstborn son is actually Jurchen. But Genghis Khan believes that Jurchen hasn't proved himself enough. So, meritocratic to the end, Genghis prefers Ogedai, his more accomplished son, as his direct heir. But, as we will find out, the Mongolian conquests have not ended. They've just begun. Till next time.